The roast was perfect, until smoke whispered of secrets. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from. Your voices keep this community alive. I can't wait to read them. Let's begin. I've seen Nero Wolfe refuse more cases than a crooked cop in a clean-up campaign. It's his favorite pastime after eating and growing orchids, waving off other people's problems with a flick of his hand, like brushing away cigar ash. So when a woman carrying a silver platter showed up at the brownstone one Tuesday afternoon, I figured she had about as much chance as a fly in Wolfe's beer glass. I opened the door. There she was, mid-40s, efficient-looking, sharp lines in her face that said she'd been managing more than her share of headaches. The platter was covered in foil, and she held it like it contained either dinner or dynamite. "Mr. Goodwin," she asked. Her tone suggested she wasn't sure if I was the butler, the detective, or the guy who washed the windows. "That's the name," I told her, "but I don't usually answer to it when it comes wrapped in aluminum." She managed half a smile. "I was told Mr. Wolfe doesn't like leaving his house, so I brought the problem to him." That was my cue to either show her out or show her in. Normally, I lean toward the former. It keeps the carpet cleaner. But there was something about the way she tightened her grip on that platter like it was a lifeline that made me hold the door wider. "Come on in, but don't expect him to leap out of his chair and shake your hand. Around here, gravity works harder on him than it does on the rest of us." She followed me into the office, where Wolfe was anchored behind his desk with a book, a bottle of beer, and a look that could wither parsley. He raised his eyes, took in the woman, the platter, and me, then let the eyes drop back to his book. That was his version of a warm hello. "This is," Wolfe asked, not moving a muscle. The woman set the platter on Wolfe's desk. The faintest whiff of roasted meat hit the air, except it wasn't the kind of smell that made you think of Sunday dinners. It had a bite, like something scorched where it shouldn't be. "My name is Margaret Vance," she said, "and that is a roast beef that ruined my life." Now, I'll admit, that line had punch. Even Wolfe's eyebrows twitched, which for him was like another man leaping to his feet. He set his book down. "Explain," he said. Margaret folded her hands in front of her. "I'm the owner of a catering company, Vance and Table. We handle private dinners, society events, boardroom meals. Last week we catered an exclusive party for the Harrington Foundation. Everything was perfect until the main dish, this roast, went to table. Within minutes, the guests were whispering. Within the hour, I was accused of sabotage, and within a day, I lost my biggest client." Wolfe sniffed. Not at her story, at the roast. Then he leaned back, puffing his cheeks. "Sabotage, a roast of beef." "Yes," she said tightly, "because it smelled of smoke. Not the pleasant kind, something acrid like burnt wood soaked in oil. People claimed it was intentional, that I was sending a message." "Archie Goodwin, that's me. I don't usually buy melodrama at face value." But there was something in her tone that wasn't theater, more like a woman hanging onto her reputation by her fingernails. Wolfe drummed a finger on his desk. "And you brought me this carcass. Why?" Margaret's jaw stiffened. "Because no one believes me. My staff insists it left the kitchen perfect. The foundation board insists I tampered with it to insult them. And she faltered. "I don't know what happened, but I need someone who can prove it wasn't me." I half expected Wolfe to yawn and wave her out. Instead, he reached forward, peeled back the foil, and bent his head over the roast like a botanist examining a strange bloom. He inhaled, long and slow. Then he straightened, eyes narrowed. "There is," he said, "a question of interference." Margaret's shoulders dropped, just a fraction. Wolfe wasn't agreeing, but he wasn't dismissing her either. That was practically a bear hug in his language. I figured it was time for me to play the practical one. So, are we taking this case, or are we just going to donate the roast to the local fire brigade? Wolfe gave me the kind of look that suggested my humor was a form of pollution. Then he turned to Margaret. You will sit, and you will tell me every person who had access to this meat from its purchase to its presentation. She sat. Wolfe poured himself another beer. And just like that, the sanctity of the brownstone was breached. Not by murder, not by theft, but by a roast that smelled wrong. And knowing Wolfe, it was enough to lead us straight into a tangle of smoke, fire, and human folly. Would you like me to continue straight into Section 2, the brownstone disturbed, or should I expand this opening further to push it toward approximately 1,300 words before moving on? Wolfe didn't flap a wing. He indicated the red leather chair with 2 glides of his fingers and told Margaret to start at the beginning and keep her verbs in order. I had the notebook and the pencil because that's my assigned role in the pageant, and because when Wolfe is interested, my shorthand becomes his memory. She took a breath, like a diver about to find out if the pool had water. The roast was prime rib, she said. Bone in, 7 ribs. We dry-aged it in-house. I purchased it Monday from Bellinger's in the market. It was rubbed, rested, and started at 4 o'clock the day of the event. Oven temp low, then sear at the end. We carved on site. Names, Wolfe said. My kitchen, Leo Mancini, head chef. Ruby Delgado, pastry. Porter Lyle, logistics. Kasia Nowak, event captain, +2. Temp, Cliff Jesus and a woman named Ginny, I don't know her last name. At the venue, Harrington House, their event manager, Lucille Trent. The foundation's executive director, Graham Toller. 2 board members who walked through at intervals. Mrs. Harrington herself and a donor, Victor LeMay. And you, Wolfe said. And me, she answered steady. Fritz came in without me buzzing him. If you think Fritz Brenner floats around the kitchen like a shy ghost, think again. He enters a room like a prayer you don't interrupt. He stopped by the desk, angled his chin at the platter, and inhaled. Then he looked at Wolfe, and the look conveyed that something had been done to an animal under insulting circumstances. Fritz, Wolfe said, tell me whether this meat has been adulterated, and by what? Fritz didn't ask for a lab. He used a fork from Wolfe's drawer, the one reserved for emergency nosing, and flaked a strip. He touched it to his lip, not so much tasting as letting the scent climb. Then he spoke in his precise way. It is smoke, but not the smoke of hardwood. There is a bitterness. Something like resin that has been burned inside a small box. Charcoal? I asked. Not charcoal for food, Fritz said. Another fuel. The taste is on the fat. The fat holds what is in the air. He set down the fork, wiped it, and gave the cloth to me like I'd know what to do with it, which I did. Don't put it anywhere near the paper basket. Wolfe turned half an inch toward Margaret. Your ovens? Clean, she said quickly. We were inspected last month, and the roast smelled fine when we loaded it into the warming cabinet. It was only at the table, when the carving started, that the odor appeared. Warming cabinet, Wolfe repeated, stroking the words like a suspicious cat. Describe it. A mobile hotbox, she said. Stainless, double door, holds trays and the roast resting rack. We preheat it. It runs on a portable element, standard. It's ours. We brought it from the commissary. Who had access to it between your kitchen and the carving? Porter loads and unloads. Kasia does the site check. Leo opens it for me when we plate or carve. That's it. At the house, the Harrington staff sometimes walk through the service hall, but they don't touch our gear. At least they're not supposed to. The doorbell rang. Fritz left us to it. I went and found a woman with a narrow briefcase and a mouth that believed in enforcement. She held up a card that said, Alyssa Quill, Harrington Foundation, Communications. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked past me like I was one of the fixtures you dust once a week. I'm here for the roast, she said to Wolfe, and to inform you that the Foundation will pursue damages if that item is not returned immediately. Margaret's hands tightened on her purse. Wolfe's eyes flattened the way they do when someone mistakes his office for a lobby. I got between the briefcase and the desk, because when people bring public relations into our private sanctuary, they usually think it comes with squatters' rights. Wolfe's voice came out level. Miss Quill, you will sit. You will lower your tone. You're in my home. She almost said something crisp. Then she felt the air in the room the way you feel humidity. You can pretend it isn't there, but your collar tells you it is. She sat. Mr. Wolfe, she said, the Foundation Host Committee is not amused. Ms. Vance sabotaged a signature event. Donors were offended. We have photographs, statements. Confound it, Wolfe said, with that mildness that carries a razor. What you have is an odor and an inference. If you possessed evidence, you would have gone to the police, not to me. You came because you suspect something you cannot state. I will learn what it is. If you impede me, you will go out. She pressed her lips. I could see the calculation pass behind her eyes. PR professionals don't like being told their next move, but they like losing control even less. She turned to Margaret. Miss Vance, you were warned about independent contractors at your events, she said. There was a disagreement with the chef and... That's not accurate, Margaret cut in. Leo and I disagreed about plating garnishes. That's routine. He's brilliant and stubborn. We weren't throwing pans. And Mr. LeMay? Quill asked, shifting. You refused his request for branding. Branding? I said. What, a monogram on the rib bone? Quill colored. Mr. LeMay suggested a smoky crust he's fond of at a restaurant in Tribeca. He offered to bring... Fuel, Wolfe supplied. He offered to bring fuel. Quill hesitated. If she'd been my witness on a stand, I would have smelted her. A small smoker unit, she conceded, but Miss Vance declined. Because it's unprofessional to let donors micromanage cooking, Margaret shot back, and because our agreement called for classic preparation. No theatrics. The office went quiet, except for the bottle's small pop when Wolfe freed another beer. He poured, watched the foam settle with priestly attention, and then said, You will list, Miss Quill, the persons who could have approached Miss Vance's cabinet at the house between arrival and service. We have cameras, she said. Do you? Wolfe's lids lowered. Let us not play. You will list the names. She gave them because in that room people usually do. I wrote Lucille Trent, staff coordinator. 2 footmen, her word, not mine, named Rafe and Daniel. The security contractor, Owen Cray. The donor liaison, who turned out to be Mr. LeMay himself, wandering where donors aren't supposed to wander. And Mrs. Harrington's assistant, Nina Corbett. Plus caterers, obviously. Good, Wolfe said. Archie. That meant phone calls. I started on Lucille Trent. She gave me the polished version. No one touched anything because no one would dare. Then she said she had to jump because the house was in uproar, and if I wanted details, I should submit a request in writing signed in triplicate. I made a note to send her 3 napkins. I called Graham Toller. He was ice with veins. He said the Foundation had retained counsel. I told him counsel could eat the smoke and tell me if it was rosemary. He clicked off. The doorbell went again. This time it was a man with thick forearms and a chef coat under a borrowed jacket. He had the look of a guy who thinks a kitchen is a country with borders. Leo Mancini. He brushed past me because cooks move through spaces like they own them, and in a kitchen they do. This was not a kitchen, but he didn't recognize the jurisdiction until he hit the carpet and saw Wolfe. Mr. Wolfe, he said, half bow, half challenge. I cooked that roast. I want to smell it. You will not touch, Wolfe said. You will stand there and use your nose. Leo obeyed. His eyes narrowed. That's not applewood. Not hickory. That's, God, creosote? Like somebody lit a toy smoker with the wrong pellets. Toy smoker, I repeated. A table unit, he snapped. For theatrics. You pass a lid over the meat and let smoke curl for the guests. It's cheap and it's popular, and I hate it. If somebody waved that anywhere near my roast, it would mark the fat. Margaret rubbed her temple. We don't own one. No, Leo said, but somebody else does. LeMay loves toys. Miss Quill stiffened. Mr. LeMay is a generous donor. Generous with opinions, Leo said. He turned to Wolfe. If you think I did that to my own roast, you don't know me. I do not know you, Wolfe said. I will. Did you quarrel with Ms. Vance that day? We spoke. He lifted a shoulder. She cut my chives. She adjusted your presentation, Margaret said, because you wanted a charred onion nest. The board requested classic garnish. Classic is dead, Leo muttered, and then shut his mouth because he was in a room where dead things keep company. Wolfe rocked the glass, watching the lines of foam slide. Miss Quill, he said, soft as grits, you will inform Mr. LeMay that his presence here would be inconvenient. However, his absence will be worse. I want him at my office tomorrow at 11. Miss Vance, you will return at the same hour with your employees. Mr. Mancini, Miss Delgado, Mr. Lyle, Miss Nowak. Mr. Goodwin will fetch the temp. Miss Quill bristled. You cannot compel donors. I am not compelling, Wolfe said. I am arranging. If you prefer, I will telephone Inspector Kramer and discuss the adulteration of food served to 24 individuals of means and standing. He is a Democrat in his indignation. That did it. She made a note she didn't need to make and stood. I'll convey your request. She gave me a glare to file and went out with her briefcase in the defensive position. Leo lingered. He looked at Margaret, and some of the steam went out of him. I didn't touch your cabinet, he said. If I'd seen anyone else touch it, I'd have cut their hand. Then he left too, because kitchens are for fights and reconciliations. Living rooms are for confessionals. Wolfe's office is for submission. Fritz came back with a small tray of rye crisps and a dish of something green that could make a bishop eat meat on Friday. He set it down where the roast wasn't, and Wolfe sampled as if to remind the universe that taste still existed. Archie, he said, the cabinet is the hinge. Miss Vance, when you approached it at the house, did you detect odor then? No, she said, not until carving. We moved the roast from the cabinet to the carving board in the anteroom off the dining hall. Leo lifted the lid. He frowned. I smelled it then. Who carried the roast from the cabinet to the board? Porter, she said, with Cliff, who was present in the anteroom. Kazia, Leo, me, and... She stopped. And Mr. LeMay, popping in to preview. He was told to wait outside. Wolfe's eyes half closed, which in him is not sleep. It's geometry. The cabinet is portable. It has vents. If a person introduced a capsule of resinous smoke to its interior or fitted a device to its vent, the fat would accept the taint. The appearance would be unmarred. The outrage would be theatrical. Why? I asked. Why smoke a roast you've paid for? Paying does not preclude petulance, Wolfe said. Nor does generosity disinfect vanity. He looked at Margaret. Your livelihood depends on confidence. Someone wished to collapse it. Either you to convert sympathy into leverage, which I discount, or an admirer, spited, a rival kitchen, a donor deprived of his toy, a host piqued by your refusal to bend, or a subordinate hungry to prove your fallibility. We will discover which. Margaret nodded. She had steadied. The platter on the desk had stopped being a bludgeon and turned back into evidence. She stood. I'll bring my team at 11. You will also bring the cabinet, Wolfe said. disassembled if necessary. Mr. Goodwin will be there to assist with ingress. I will examine it here. That put a new crease in my day, but I've muscled worse through that doorway. After she left, the room got its shape back. The air settled like a pond after a skipped stone. Wolfe leaned an inch and rang for another beer, but Fritz was already there with one, because Fritz always is when gravity needs help. "You think it's the donor," I said. "I think nothing," Wolfe said. "I detest donors. They confuse money with taste. But detestation is not deduction. We will assemble them and listen until one trips." "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime," he said, "you will find the temp named Ginny and the man called Cliff. You will also speak with the security contractor, Mr. Cray, and confirm the existence and placement of cameras. You will request footage. When they decline, you will acquire it." "Legally?" "Effectively," he said. I went to get my hat. He stopped me with my name. "Archie." "Yeah?" "Protect my kitchen," he said, glancing at the platter. "If anyone proposes to demonstrate a table smoker within these walls, you will break his device over his head." "Politely." "Politely," I said, and closed the door on the roast that had walked into our lives and stunk up the place without shedding a drop of blood. The brownstone doesn't like outsiders. When they come anyway, something in the timber creaks. You can call it disturbance, or you can call it the beginning of a case. Either way, it means I keep my notebook and my shoes ready, and Wolfe keeps his chair and his temper, and between us, we try to prove that truth doesn't have to shout to be heard. The next morning broke grey and damp, which was just as well, since I wasn't going to be spending it lounging in Central Park. I had a schedule Wolfe had drawn tighter than Fritz's soufflé. By 11 o'clock sharp, our office was supposed to look like a courtroom without a jury. Suspects, witnesses, and one roast-tainted warming cabinet rolled in like a contraband piano. My job was to make sure all the right faces and all the right props appeared, preferably without a police escort attached. I started early, chasing the temp. Cliff Sue was easy. He lived in a studio near Canal, stacked with cookbooks and bicycle parts. He opened the door with the kind of caution you expect from someone who knows the landlord is around with a rent slip. When I explained who I was and that Mr. Wolfe had a pressing interest in his activities with roast beef, Cliff blinked twice and said, "I didn't touch it." Which is a lovely opener if you want a detective to keep pressing. He was wiry, restless, the type who can carry heavy trays but looks like he lives on coffee. He insisted his job was hauling and lifting, not meddling. When I asked him who moved the roast from the cabinet to the board, he admitted he did it with porter. Did he notice any smell then? Number, did he see anyone loiter near the cabinet? Not really, except for that donor guy with the sharp suit, who liked to wander. I thanked him and told him to be at Wolfe's at 11. He grumbled about shifts, but agreed. Ginny was another story. She wasn't listed with an agency. Margaret had picked her up last minute from a friend's recommendation, which is a red flag in catering or in crime. I found her in a walk-up in Queens. She was young, maybe 20, nervous eyes, wearing a T-shirt that looked like it had spent the night on the floor. She said she didn't want trouble, which is a phrase that usually signals it's already moved in and unpacked. I leaned on her gently, the way you do when someone looks like they'll bolt if you cough too loud. She admitted she'd manned the appetizer station most of the night. Did she handle the roast? Number, did she open the cabinet? Number, did she see anyone do it? She hesitated, then said she saw Mr. LeMay leaning in, sniffing around, but thought nothing of it because he was a donor, and donors apparently get to act like they own both the art and the air. I made a note and told her to show up at the brownstone. She balked, but I made it clear she'd be better off explaining herself to Wolfe than to the police, if it came to that. By the time I cabbed back to 35th Street, a small convoy had already arrived. Margaret stood in the front hall, tense but composed, with her crew clustered like mismatched chess pieces. Leo was pacing with his arms folded. Ruby Delgado fiddled with a pastry bag she'd brought as if she might ice the truth onto a cupcake. Porter looked solid and silent as a cinder block, and Cassia, tall and stern, kept a tight hold on the group like she was running a drill. The cabinet, shiny and accusatory, had been wheeled in by Cliff and Porter. It smelled faintly metallic and held more secrets than a diary. Inside, Wolfe was seated, prepared as if this were merely another Tuesday, which it was. He had the big globe lamp glowing, his desk polished, and a row of beer bottles ready as if deduction required hydration. Fritz hovered, pretending to dust, but actually eyeing the cabinet like it had committed a culinary felony. When everyone had been arranged, Wolfe lifted his eyes. "You will sit as indicated." He gestured, and the group formed a semicircle around his desk, looking like a reluctant choir. Margaret perched forward, Cassia rigid, Leo bristling, Ruby shy, Porter stoic, Cliff wary, Ginny pale. "You are here," Wolfe said, "because a piece of meat arrived at table with an odor not its own. That odor was introduced by someone between its removal from oven and its arrival at table. You all were in proximity to that journey. I will determine who and why. To hasten matters, Mr. Goodwin will recount what he has already learned." That was my cue. I ran through the highlights. Cliff moved the roast with Porter. No smell detected then. Ginny saw LeMay hovering near the cabinet. Leo despised table smokers. Margaret had refused LeMay's offer of theatrics. Quill had admitted LeMay wandered into off-limit spaces. Each detail tightened the rope. Wolfe inclined his head. "Mr. Mancini, you despise toy smokers, yes?" "Of course," Leo growled. "They ruin flavor." "And you quarreled with Miss Vance about garnish." "A professional disagreement." "Yet you had opportunity. You approached the cabinet freely." Leo's jaw set. "I wouldn't torch my own work. That roast was my name on a plate." Wolfe shifted to Ruby. "You, Miss Delgado, saw nothing?" She shook her head quickly. "I was in pastry all night. Sugar doesn't smoke like that." "Mr. Lyle." Wolfe's gaze landed on Porter. He rumbled low. "I loaded. I carried. I didn't tamper." "Did you observe Mr. LeMay?" "Yeah. He poked his nose in. I told him to step back." He laughed. "And you permitted him?" Wolfe asked. Porter looked away. "He's a donor. They pay the bills. You don't shove them." "Indeed," Wolfe murmured. Then to Cassia, "You supervise? Did you check the cabinet?" "Yes," she said crisply. "Twice. No odor. But when the roast came out, it was different. Wrong." Wolfe's eyes half closed. "Miss Ginny, you saw Mr. LeMay near the cabinet. Did he carry anything?" She bit her lip. "A small wooden box, like a jewelry box. He opened it, laughed, shut it. I thought it was a trick." That sent a small ripple through the room. Leo muttered something about pellets. Margaret stiffened. The bell rang again. I opened it to find Victor LeMay himself, silk scarf, too much cologne, carrying a cane like it had been delivered with his ego. Miss Quill trailed him, defensive as ever. "Mr. Wolfe," LeMay said, striding in, "I gather I've been summoned as though this were a trial. Very theatrical." "Sit," Wolfe said. He sat, smiling as if the room were his audience. Wolfe waited until silence was as thick as Fritz's sauce. Then he spoke. "You introduced smoke to Miss Vance's roast," Wolfe said, flat as a brick. The smile wavered. "Nonsense." "I merely admired the work. Perhaps I opened a cigar case near it." "No," Wolfe cut in. "Not cigars. Resin pellets. A portable smoker box. You wished your preference displayed. When denied, you indulged your vanity clandestinely. The fat absorbed the taint. The roast carried it to table. Miss Vance was humiliated." LeMay laughed too loudly. "You can't prove that?" "I will," Wolfe said. "Your box. Produce it." LeMay shifted. Miss Quill touched his arm, warning him. Wolfe leaned forward half an inch, which in his language was a thunderclap. "You will produce it here, or I will telephone Inspector Kramer. He will treat it as food tampering, a public endangerment. A donor's name will not shield you." The room held its breath. LeMay's smile cracked. Finally he exhaled, long and theatrical. "Very well." I indulged a flourish. I thought it would amuse. Hardly a crime. "Crime or not," Wolfe said. It was sabotage. "Miss Vance's reputation was maligned. You will write to the Foundation Board admitting your act. You will compensate Miss Vance for the contract lost, and you will not again introduce smoke to any dish not your own." LeMay's color rose. "You dare?" "Yes," Wolfe said. "I dare, and I will." Quill leaned in, whispering fiercely. LeMay's bluster sagged. Finally he nodded, muttering something about misunderstandings. Wolfe ignored the theatrics. He raised his beer, sipped, and set it down. "This gathering is concluded," he said. "Archie, see them out. Miss Vance, remain." I herded the group like reluctant cattle. LeMay stormed, Quill fumed, Leo muttered, Ginny fled. Porter kept his silence, Ruby sighed, Casia marched. Finally only Margaret remained. She looked at Wolfe with something like awe. "You saved me," she said. "No," Wolfe corrected. "I saved my nose. I will not permit food to be soiled by vainglory." She smiled faintly. "Still thank you." Wolfe waved her away like smoke itself. "Fritz, dinner." I closed my notebook, wondering which smelled stronger, LeMay's cologne or Wolfe's sense of victory. Either way, the brownstone had survived its intrusion, and the roast had delivered more than smoke. It had delivered justice. Wolfe's way. Would you like me to continue directly into the next section, building the deeper circle of suspects' tension, or expand this office confrontation toward a full 1,200-word weight with added dialogue and Wolfe's philosophical rumination? If Wolfe had considered the business concluded when he lifted his beer, it would have stayed concluded. But I've learned to watch the angle of the bottle when he sets it down. If it lands with the neck pointing at the phone instead of the wastebasket, he isn't done. This one pointed at the phone like a compass needle. I was halfway to the door when he said my name. "Archie, we have a confession that satisfies the offended, not the facts. The odor is wrong. LeMay's vanity explains the scene, not the scent. Applewood showmanship versus tar in the fat," I said. He nodded. "Go. Security first. Miss Corbett second. Mr. Panzer will observe Mr. LeMay. Fritz will examine the cabinet when Miss Vance returns it to the kitchen. We will not eat theatrics." That put my feet on the pavement and my mind on the neat grey pile of lies we'd swept into the hallway. The Harrington house sits where old money likes to pretend it's still the only currency. Stone, ironwork, hushed staff. I gave my name at the door and asked for Lucille Trent. She arrived with a smile ironed on and a clipboard thick enough to be armor. "Mr. Goodwin, we have already apologized to our guests for the incident. If Ms. Vance persuaded Mr. Wolfe to, congratulations," I told her. "Your apology has been accepted by exactly no one involved. I'm here for the security contractor." That earned a tilt of the chin that said I was a staff problem, not a guest. She led me downstairs to an office where screens glowed and a man in his 40s with shoulders like a dock worker watched 4 camera feeds and a baseball game in a corner window. Owen Cray shook my hand with a grip that assessed you back. "We retain footage for 90 days, he said before I could ask. 2 cameras in the service hall, 1 on the anteroom. No audio. You want gossip, you hire a novelist." He queued up the night. We scrubbed to the hour between arrival and carving. The service hall looked like every service hall. Painted brick, carts, board. Speed. The cabinet rolled in with Porter at the front and Cliff behind, Casia ahead checking doors. At 7:12, they parked it by an outlet and moved on to the appetizer rush. At 7:19, LeMay drifted into frame, cane tucked, scarf floating, a small square box in his hand. He leaned toward the cabinet, opened the box, did a flourish with his wrist like a magician practicing a coin vanish, and sashayed out. If the world needed proof of his meddling, there it was. At 7:26, Lucille herself breezed by, glanced, kept going. At 7:34, the hall emptied for 20 seconds. When bodies came back, nothing obvious had changed. "Back up," I said. "Closer to 34. Cray zoomed. The pixels didn't volunteer names, but I saw motion at the cabinet level. A hand from off frame, quick, not theatrical. It reached for the lower vent slats, did something under the lip, then vanished. The frame caught a sliver, a wrist with a thin bracelet, metallic, snake-patterned, and a corner of a leather folio pressed against a hip. The height looked wrong for LeMay, too slight. We checked the anteroom camera at 7:48 as the roast came out. Leo lifted the lid, his face pinched. Margaret leaned in. Cassia stiffened. I could almost smell the change through glass. If smoke had been introduced in the hall, the fat would have been holding the secret like a diary under a pillow. "Can I get a copy?" I asked. "Authorized?" Cray asked. "Eventually," I told him, and he grunted. I left him with the baseball score and took the back stairs up. Lucille met me in the corridor, smile still ironed. "Everything you need?" "Almost. Where can I find Ms. Corbett?" "Nina is Mrs. Harrington's assistant," she said, "which means she's very busy." "Sure," I said. "Busy enough to wear a snake bracelet on a service floor." The smile faltered exactly one syllable. Then she directed me to a small office near the library. Nina Corbett had the kind of efficient prettiness you get when you schedule it. Dark hair, neat bun, cream blouse that knew how to stay crisp. A leather folio sat open at her elbow. She didn't stand. "You must be Mr. Goodwin," she said, and it was half greeting, half preemptive defense. "If this is about that unfortunate roast, I've given Miss Quill a statement." "I bet you have," I said, and sat uninvited. "I'll take the director's cut. You were in the service hall around 7:30. Wearing a bracelet that could hypnotize a mongoose, you leaned in near the caterer's cabinet. Why?" Her pupils expanded, contracted, and then she smiled like a person who has practiced coming clean without emptying pockets. She reached into the folio and produced a handsome little set. A travel cocktail smoker kit, brass lid, a tiny hand pump, and tins labeled with fonts that took themselves seriously. "After dinner, I host digestives," she said. "Aromatics are on trend." I previewed the garnish station to see what would clash. I may have stood too close to a box with vents. I did not touch it. I'm meticulous. She slid a tin across the desk. "See? Citrus peel chips. Not tar." The tin was citrus, all right. Bright as a lemon grove. But something else lived in the folio. A faint, resinous ghost like campfire married to varnish. Her hands smelled like soap and cologne. The folio smelled like last night. "Nice kit," I said. "Where's the fun box with resin pellets?" She blinked. "I don't know what that is." "Then you're about to learn," I told her and stood. "Save me the PR. You were where you shouldn't be. If you didn't touch anything, good for you. If you did, we'll find out. Either way, don't leave town before the third act." I left her polishing her smile and called Saul from the sidewalk. Saul Panzer's voice is the sound you put on if you want the city to tell you where it hid the truth. "LeMay?" he said. "He stopped by a specialty shop on Houston last week. Aromatic Atelier. Bought a table smoker and 2 tins of fruitwood chips." The clerk remembered the scarf. "Today he ducked into a bar in Tribeca, Bar Sirocco. Their head bartender is a resin evangelist. They use pine-derived pellets for a house cocktail. LeMay asked about it. Didn't buy." "Resin," I said. "Not for food," Saul said. You want that in a glass, not in a rib roast. I thanked him and aimed my shoes at Sirocco. The bartender wore a mustache that required a zoning permit and treated his smoker like a violin. He showed me the pellets, small, translucent nuggets, hard as candy, distilled from pine sap, sold under a label that promised forest notes and delivered a lumberyard. He grinned when I winced. Too much if you're not careful, he said. A little goes a long way. Goes anywhere else? I asked. Like into a cabinet vent. He laughed. You could perfume a room with a handful. On my way out, I snagged a card from a display. Resina Verde, purveyors of aromatic resins to people who needed their drinks to smell like carpentry. The card had a handwritten note. Nina C. Order placed. Pickup Tuesday. I slid it into my wallet and phoned Wolfe. He said when I laid it out. So, Mr. LeMay provided the flourish and the cover. Miss Corbett provided the taint. She'll deny, I said. She's already got the props to sell a harmless story. She may deny, Wolfe said. Evidence won't. Return. Ms. Vance has brought the cabinet. Back at the brownstone, Fritz had the stainless beast disemboweled on oilcloth like a surgeon who liked order. The shelves and racks lay in neat ranks. He pointed with a tool at the lower vent. Someone had slipped a gauze-thin pad under the lip, the kind you use to scent linens if your linens enjoy hardship. It was faintly amber, brittle now. When Fritz cracked a corner with tweezers, the air coughed up the same bitter sigh we'd met in the fat. Aroma pad, Fritz said, disapproving each syllable. Not culinary. Cray's camera, I told Wolfe, caught a hand at the vent. Bracelet, narrow wrist. Our friend Nina orders resin by the note card. Good, Wolfe said. Better would be footage. He looked at me. Mr. Cray will decide to cooperate. I'll help him decide, I said. Before I could reach the hall, the phone rang. I took it. Margaret's voice was tight as wire. Archie, I'm at the commissary. Someone broke in. Take a breath, I said. What's gone? Not money. The spice rack. Half the jars are pulled forward. Deliberate. The cabinet we didn't bring is scratched at the vent. Someone wanted me to feel vulnerable. Stay put, I told her. Don't touch anything. Wolfe had listened with his eyes closed. When I hung up, he opened them. Pressure, he said. Incompetent, but not idle. Whoever planned this wanted ruin, not embarrassment. A donor's mischief paved the stage. A functionary executed the insult. A rival or romantic attachment presses now to finish the collapse. Rival, I said. Miss Delgado, Wolfe said, turning to Ruby, who had stayed to help Fritz. Who benefits if Miss Vance falters? Ruby flushed. Competitors. Sable and Time have been circling the foundation for months. Their sales manager used to date Nina, if you want the gossip. He's slick. He promised experiential dining. Names, Wolfe said. Trevor Pike, she said. And Nina played hostess at one of their tastings last year. Everyone knows. Pieces were starting to clink in my head like ice finding its shape in a glass. LeMay for the flourish, Nina for the resin. Trevor Pike waiting in the wings with experiential dining and a hook in the house staff. Break in the commissary to make Margaret feel the ground tilt under her feet. If you took away a small company's confidence, you didn't need to prove it incompetent. You needed only to make it doubt itself in front of the right people. I went back to Harrington with a request dressed as an ultimatum and came away with a copy of the footage on a drive because Owen Cray prefers to be on the side of men who finish sentences. On the way out, I passed Nina in the hall. Her bracelet winked. She smiled with her lips. You're efficient, she said. Only when someone rearranges spices, I said. It offends me. At the brownstone, we watched the footage on Wolfe's big screen. LeMay's flourish at 7:19 played like a trailer for his vanity. At 7:34, the hand came in low and quick, palming the vent with practiced economy. Up close, the bracelet's head was distinct, a small gold serpent biting its tail. The leather folio's corner wore a smear of amber I'd seen before on Sirocco's bar towels. Wolfe didn't smile. He's not a smiler by habit, but he breathed a little more deeply. "Mr. Panzer," he said into the phone, "find Trevor, Pike. Bring me his calendar for the last month and any communications with Miss Corbett or Mr. LeMay. Miss Vance, change your locks." Margaret, who had come in with the break-in tremor still in her voice, nodded. "Do I confront anyone?" "No," Wolfe said. "You will rest. You will not speak to press. You will not apologize. You will not explain. Explanations now are capitulations. We will set the table." I took the drive to my desk and backed it up because I've learned that electronics sometimes develop scruples at the wrong time. Fritz sealed the aroma pad in a jar, as if it were a rare fungal specimen. Wolfe made a brief call to Kramer that sounded like two old enemies exchanging polite threats disguised as courtesies, and then he leaned back and closed his eyes again. "You're not going to like this," I said, "but LeMay did enough to hang himself. Why not let him dangle and call it good?" "Because," Wolfe said, "the man is a fool, not a vandal. His folly is useful to others. Those others are the danger. They will do it again to someone else, with greater appetite. I prefer my meals without such seasoning." He opened his eyes to the ceiling moldings and let silence sit with us, the way he does when he's arranging pieces in a pattern only he can see. The brownstone had been disturbed, then settled, then lifted by another draft. Out on the street, a horn blared, and the city reminded us it had no stake in our little crusade. My phone buzzed. Saul, short and clean. "Pike met LeMay 2 weeks ago at Sirocco. Drinks, then a tasting invite. Nina joined. Texts confirm. Forwarding." Another buzz. "Cray, gruffer. If anyone asks, you pried it from me. If anyone else asks, I never met you." A third. Margaret again. Steadier now. "Locks changed. Porter's standing guard. We're ready for whatever comes." I looked at Wolfe. He nodded once, which in that room is as close as you get to a drum roll. "Tomorrow," he said, 11:30. The office. "We will invite Mr. Pike, Miss Corbett, Mr. LeMay, Miss Trent, Mr. Toller. We will ask why a serpent bit its tail in my hallway at 7:34, and then we will feed the serpent its own tail." "Saul to fetch?" I asked. "Saul to shepherd," he said. "You will manage the chairs. Fritz will bar the door to foolishness, and I will sit." He did, and for a minute the world returned to its right proportions. Fritz moved softly in the kitchen. The orchids upstairs breathed their tropical arrogance. A jar on the desk held a brittle square that could ruin a career, and Wolfe arranged an invisible menu for people who had mistaken hospitality for weakness. Dinner would be lamb, I guessed, from the hint of rosemary that floated in from the hall. The brownstone had a way of asserting itself after an intrusion. It didn't roar. It breathed, and you were reminded that inside these walls, precision was not an affectation. It was the house rule. I sharpened a pencil and checked. The chairs again. When you're preparing for a gathering in that office, you think about where a person will sit and what they'll see when they lift their chin. Some men talk to the window, some talk to a painting. The guilty talk to themselves. Wolfe listens to the talk that doesn't make sound. My job is to set the acoustics. By the time the bottle caps clinked into the tray and Fritz announced dinner, we had a coil of proof and a string to pull. We'd started with a roast that smelled of smoke. Now it smelled like motive, and if you've ever fed a motive into Wolfe's mind, you know what happens next. It gets seasoned, seared, rested, and carved, and by the time it reaches the table, you see exactly where the knife should go. By the time the next morning crept in, the brownstone was wound as tight as a violin string. Wolfe didn't pace. That would require legs to do more than support his torso, but his silence was heavier than most men's tirades. I set the office as if for a matinee performance. Chairs arranged, air cleared, windows shut, desk blotter neat enough to double as a mirror. Fritz polished the silver tray as though it would be called upon to testify. I checked the phone twice, made sure the wire recorder was loaded in the drawer, because Wolfe likes his truth preserved like jam, and tried not to think about the fact we were about to host a dinner party without the dinner. Saul Panzer arrived first, soft-footed, carrying a folder fat with printouts. He nodded to Wolfe, handed me the file, and disappeared into the kitchen where Fritz had promised him coffee that could fortify a cavalry charge. The file held transcripts of messages between Trevor Pike and Nina Corbett, all laced with the kind of overconfident bravado people use when they believe text strings vanish into thin air. They didn't say, "Let's sabotage the roast," but they said, "Foundation board, we'll notice flaws," and "Don't let Vance hold steady." That was close enough to treason in catering. At 11:30 sharp, the procession began. Margaret Vance entered with her jaw set, but her eyes carrying the tremor of someone about to face execution or absolution. Leo stalked behind her, muttering culinary insults under his breath. Kezia came in like a schoolteacher prepared to scold the class. Porter lumbered silently. Ruby clutched a handbag like a lifeline. Cliff and Ginny slid in on the edges, anxious and small. Then came the outsiders. Lucille Trent with her clipboard armor. Graham Toller, stiff as a museum guard, his lips pressed into a line that could cut glass. Victor LeMay, of course, in another scarf and another wave of cologne, Kane tapping out an ego rhythm. Nina Corbett followed, serene, bracelet gleaming at her wrist, leather folio under her arm like a passport to impunity. And finally, Trevor Pike, a man who looked like he'd auditioned for the role of modern dining visionary and gotten the part. Slim suit, narrow tie, smile, engineered to sell ideas about experiences nobody wanted. Wolfe let them settle into the chairs. He didn't speak at first. He let silence climb up the walls, curl under the ceiling, and hang there until the last cough and shuffle died. Then he opened his eyes, which had been closed though he wasn't asleep. "You are here," he said, voice low and steady, "because a roast was altered." It smelled of resinous smoke, not hard wood. That alteration humiliated Miss Vance and damaged her livelihood. A donor, an assistant, and a rival chef conspired, whether loosely or deliberately, to bring about this insult. I have proof of the act, and I have inference of the motive. We will untangle it now. LeMay laughed first. It was too quick, too loud, and it earned him a glance from Wolfe that could have chilled soup. "I've admitted my part," LeMay said. "A flourish, a toy smoker, nothing more." "Indeed," Wolfe said. "You admitted the flourish, but not the resin." He gestured to me, and I rolled the footage on the screen. LeMay leaning in with his box, doing his theatrical flourish. Murmurs rose. Then the frame at 7:34. The quick hand, the bracelet flashing, the folio corner. I paused and zoomed. The serpent bracelet glinted, distinct and damning. Nina sat back, expression smooth, but her fingers twitched once at her folio. "That," Wolfe said, "is the act. Not smoke for flavor, but resin for sabotage." A pad slipped into the vent. The fat absorbed it. The result was acrid, unpleasant, and ruinous. Nina lifted her chin. "That could be anyone. The image is blurred. You cannot say it is me." "No," Wolfe said, and his lids lowered. "Your bracelet was purchased 6 months ago from Esme and Company, one of a kind. You wear it daily. You ordered resin pellets last week from Resina Verde. You assisted Mr. Pike at Sable and Time, whose ambition was to supplant Ms. Vance with the Harrington Foundation, and you carried a folio with a smear of amber resin. Should I continue?" Trevor Pike raised his hands, mock calm. "Now wait. I had no part in—" "Yes," Wolfe said, cutting him like a cleaver. "You had part. You invited Mr. LeMay to Bar Sirocco, where you encouraged his vanity with resin cocktails. You flattered his taste, then abandoned him to his folly. You used him as cover. While his flourish created distraction, your confederate altered the cabinet. The result was predictable. Donors sniffed smoke. Miss Vance was blamed, and you, Mr. Pike, intended to step into the breach, presenting your firm as the rescue. Pike flushed, but kept the salesman's smile. That's speculation. No, Wolfe said. That is deduction, supported by evidence. He signaled, and I dropped the next sheet on the desk. Saul's transcript. Nina to Pike. If Roast stumbles, we offer rescue. Pike to Nina. LeMay is our distraction. Nina to Pike. Pad ready. Pike to Nina. Foundation will prefer us after failure. The room buzzed. Lucille Trent's face went white. Graham Toller frowned so deep his eyebrows threatened to collapse. Margaret sat with her fists clenched, breathing as though each exhale took weight off her chest. Nina tried one last turn. These are private messages. Misinterpreted. I never placed a pad. I only sampled aromas. You cannot prove intent. Intent, Wolfe said, is writ in the result. Your hand at the cabinet is not interpretation. It is action. Your messages are not poetry. They are conspiracy, and your association with Mr. Pike completes the circle. Wolfe leaned back, his voice dropping even lower, which in that room is how thunder sounds. Miss Trent, Mr. Toller, you have your answer. Ms. Vance is exonerated. Your donors were not insulted by her hand, but by the vanity of one man, the ambition of another, and the connivance of an assistant who mistook sabotage for strategy. Toller shifted, looking at Margaret. For the first time since he'd entered, his face softened. If this is true, he said, we owe you restitution. It is true, Wolfe said, and restitution is owed, not only in currency, but in confidence. The board will retract its aspersions and renew its contracts, or Inspector Kramer will be invited to examine the evidence. There was a silence. Then Lucille Trent, clipboard sagging, said, We will correct the record. LeMay blustered, then wilted when Saul, silent in the back, stepped forward just far enough to let his presence be noticed. Saul doesn't have to threaten. He just has to exist. LeMay adjusted his scarf and muttered about misunderstandings. Pike sat rigid, smile gone. Nina kept her chin high, but her hands folded too tightly. The serpent bracelet glinted once more, but this time it looked more like chains than jewelry. Wolfe dismissed them with a flick of fingers. Chairs scraped, protests muttered, but the current moved them toward the door. Saul followed, ensuring no one tried a last-minute escape from dignity. When the office was empty except for Margaret, Wolfe, Fritz, and me, the air felt different. The brownstone had been invaded, but order was restored. Margaret sat forward, eyes bright now instead of weary. I can't thank you enough, she said. Wolfe waved her thanks aside. Do not thank me. Thank the integrity of flavor. Men and women may deceive, but food does not. It carries every scent it is given. In that, it is more honest than people. She smiled, stood, and shook my hand. You've both saved my business. I won't forget it. When she had gone, Wolfe closed his eyes again, lips pursed, breathing deep. Fritz entered with a platter covered by silver. He removed the lid, and the air filled with the clean, rich scent of lamb, rosemary, garlic, the kind of aroma that reassures you the world hasn't gone entirely mad. Wolfe lifted his fork. Observe, Archie, he said. This is smoke as it should be. Hardwood, balanced, a whisper. Not a shout. Man may seek to corrupt flavor for vanity, but flavor resists. It reveals the truth. I leaned back, notebook closed, watching him taste victory disguised as dinner. Outside, New York honked and hurried, indifferent to roasts, resin, or reputations. Inside, the brownstone was still, steady, restored to its right rhythm. The case was closed, the air was clear, and Wolfe had the last word, as always. And me? I had the last note, scribbled quick and clean. Never underestimate the power of a roast. Not when Wolfe is in the room. If you've ever watched Wolfe finish a case, you know he doesn't so much stop as let momentum taper until it lands exactly where he wanted it to all along. He'd carved LeMay, Nina, and Pike clean enough to plate, and most men would have called it a day. But I've worked for him long enough to recognize the aftertaste that means he isn't quite done. It isn't triumph. Wolfe doesn't do victory laps. It's a sort of moral indigestion. The palate detects a trace note left behind and refuses to ignore it. He didn't say a word about it through lunch. He didn't have to. He was quieter than usual, which is saying something for a man who treats silence like an heirloom. After Fritz's coffee, he closed his eyes and pretended the world had the decency to go away. It didn't. My phone rang 20 minutes later and unrolled the kind of headline that gives public relations people night sweats. "Mr. Goodwin?" The voice was crisp, female, and determined to sound composed. "Alyssa Quill. Before you crow, a blogger posted that Wolfe staged the whole thing with Miss Vance to humiliate donors. The foundation is being tagged in the comments. We are considering a statement." "Make it short," I told her. 4 words. "We were the dupes." "That is not the tone," she said, "and Mr. Toller is anxious that any criminal charges be handled discreetly." "Talk to Kramer about discretion," I said. "He collects it the way a harbor collects fog." I hung up and looked at Wolfe. He hadn't moved, but his lids had gone from closed to merely shuttered. "Quill?" he asked. "Worried the internet will think she chose the wrong friends," I said. "She did." "Pa," Wolfe said, which is his compromise between profanity and prayer. They will swing between apology and indignation until they are bored, and then they will congratulate themselves on their discernment. "We will insulate Miss Vance before the swing completes. Call Toller. Invite him, Miss Trent, and 2 board members whose palates are not wholly numbed by fashion to a demonstration this evening. 5:30. I blinked. "You're inviting the Harrington board into the brownstone at dinner hour." "I am inviting 4 mouths," he said. "They will attend or they will suffer Kramer. Choose." I chose because I enjoy my job and my paycheck, and the way Wolfe uses choose when he means do as I tell you. Toller hemmed and hawed, then found his spine when I murmured the magic word footage. Miss Trent came because she wasn't going to let her boss walk into our den without a clipboard. The board members turned out to be Mrs. Harrington herself. Steel hair, sharp eyes, the carriage of someone accustomed to being waited for, and a thin gentleman named Desmond Kerr, whose tie cost more than my rent, but not more than his opinions. They arrived at 5:28, which tells you all you need to know about people who run foundations. Fritz didn't greet them. He doesn't greet anyone during service. I parked them in the office and kept the talk polite while Wolfe finished coaxing Fritz through whatever symphony he had in mind. At 6 sharp he entered and gave a nod that meant follow, a gesture he saves for people he intends to teach. In the dining room, the table was set for 6 with the formality that makes grown men swallow. On a sideboard, 2 domed platters waited like twin secrets. Fritz stood beside them as if they were grandchildren. Wolfe took his seat, heavy and inevitable, and lifted a hand. "You were served a roast last week that had been adulterated," he said. "No more flourish than a tax bill. Tonight you will taste 3 things: pure smoke, resin taint, and proper restraint. Your tongues will instruct you, and you will stop making fools of yourselves." Mrs. Harrington's mouth twitched. It could have become a smile in friendlier weather. Toller had the expression of a man who'd boarded the wrong train. I lifted the first dome. The air received a clean, warm kiss. Hardwood smoke, fat, pepper, and a whisper of rosemary. Fritz carved thin slices. They went around. Wolfe watched their faces like a botanist watches light. He signaled for the second dome. Fritz lifted it. The first breath carried the faint, varnishy bitterness we'd come to know too well. He didn't carve from that one. He dipped a spoon, flicked a drop of rendered fat into a small glass, and held it under Mrs. Harrington's nose. "Fat is memory," he said. "It keeps the truth. Now you know what your guests smelled. Somebody's vanity with a chemical tail." Kerr flinched, genuinely offended, either at the odor or the implied insult to his taste. Miss Trent went pale in a way that suggested her clipboard had abandoned her emotionally. Toller swallowed. Mrs. Harrington inhaled again, brief and clinical. "And the third?" she asked. Wolfe inclined his head. Fritz brought a smaller plate, a slice that had been briefly held under a lid with applewood smoke. Not resin, not a parlor trick, just a touch. They tasted. If you think you can't see relief, you haven't watched rich people realize they've been spared public idiocy. "Now," Wolfe said, "you will restore Miss Vance's contract, publish a statement specifying the source of the taint, and cease tolerating donors who bring toys to your kitchen, or I will invite Inspector Kramer to examine your premises and your staff and the messages in my possession, and he will do it with his customary restraint." Mrs. Harrington set down her fork. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, tone neutral as a surgeon's gloves, "I do not enjoy being instructed in my home. But this is not my home. This is yours. You have made your point. Miss Vance will be restored and compensated." She turned a basilisk's glance on Toller. "Draft it." Toller nodded. He had finally found the rung labeled self-preservation. "Good," Wolfe said. He closed his eyes. That would have been rude in anybody else. In him, it's a benediction that dismisses you without saying so. They took it. Miss Trent thanked Fritz, which marked her as salvageable. When they had gone, I collected plates and pleased myself by not licking any. Fritz allowed himself one of his small smiles, the kind you can miss if you blink. "You just staged a tasting to rewrite public narrative," I said to Wolfe in the office. "You're getting devious." "I am correcting error," he said. "Deviousness is the vice of men who cannot afford precision. Sit. Kramer is coming." "He is?" I said. "You invited him." "I informed him," Wolfe said, "that a donor had admitted to tampering and might require a leash. He chose to visit." Right on cue, the doorbell developed personality. I opened to Inspector Kramer chewing an unlit cigar and wearing the face that means he isn't in the mood for wit, and he's never in the mood for wit. "Wolfe," he said by way of greeting, walking in like he'd been granted a warrant by God. "I hear you've been running a cooking class for millionaires. If you start charging tuition, I want the tax returns." Wolfe inclined his head toward a chair. Kramer didn't take it. He glowered, standing. I handed over a neat packet. The footage stills, the transcripts, a typed summary, and the sealed jar with the brittle pad. He grunted approval against his will. "LeMay's getting a summons," he said. "He can argue his intent to a judge. The other two, Corbett and Pike, I'll enjoy." "If you require them," Wolfe said, "they are not flight risks. Mr. Panzer is watching." Kramer gave Saul a nod that meant partnership in that peculiar war they fight together when they aren't pretending to dislike each other. He stuck the cigar back in his mouth. "You know what I don't like?" "Many things," Wolfe said. "I don't like that you got to throw the party," Kramer said, "but I'll take the gift." He tucked the jar into his coat with the same care he'd give a grenade and stomped out, taking a gust of street air with him. Silence returned to its assigned seat. I sat, let my bones feel the chair, and watched Wolfe not move. "You're satisfied?" I said. "No," he said. "I am concluded. Satisfaction is a lower appetite. The woman's livelihood is protected. The board has learned something beyond manners. The police will tidy. And my house is mine again." He glanced at the empty platter. "We will not discuss resin at table." "You already did," I said. "I will forget," he said, "out of charity to my stomach." The evening cooled itself down the stoop. I took a walk to shoo the day out of my head and make room for something less acrid. On the corner, a kid was selling pretzels that smelled like dough and honest heat. I bought one, bit in, and felt the simple relief of flour and salt. When I got back, the office lamp was a pool on the desk, and Wolfe was in his chair with a book as if nothing had happened to the world outside his covers. "You want the last note?" I asked. He didn't look up. "You always do," he said. "All right," I told him. "Here it is. In a city built on noise, the quietest thing is fat remembering what touched it. Tonight, 4 people learned to listen. That's a win." He turned a page. "Piffle," he said. "They learned not to foul dinner." He let a beat pass, then added, softer, "But yes, fat remembers. So do men. That is why we must be careful what we permit to touch us." He read. I sat. Fritz drifted by with a glass that smelled of lemon peel and decency and put it down at my elbow like an apology from the day. The brownstone breathed. The orchids upstairs exhaled their smug tropical sermons. Somewhere, Kramer's car grumbled closer to the precinct, hauling a jar that would make a tidy chain for a bracelet and a set of messages into evidence. The phone rang once more before the night gave up. Margaret. Her voice was lighter now, like it had put down a box. "We've had 3 calls," she said. "Apologies. 2 new inquiries. One from a board member who wants us to cater his anniversary. I told Kasia to stop crying and pick a menu." "Good," I said. "If Leo insists on charred onion nests for love, tell him he can have them." She laughed. It was a good sound. "Tell Mr. Wolfe. Tell him there's a place at my table any time." I hung up and didn't relay that particular offer. Wolfe eats only on his turf and gods, and he has stronger opinions about which is which than the clergy. I did tell him about the calls. He nodded once without lifting his eyes. "Justice," he said, "is a persistent flavor. It lingers. That is sometimes enough." We let it linger. Outside, the city continued to do what it does: sell, buy, shout, jostle, forgive and forget in uneven amounts. Inside, a case that had trespassed into our air was filed and shelved. The house relaxed, a muscle unclenched. And if I slept a little better that night, chalk it up to the absence of resin in the world immediately around me. There are nights when no newsprint, no siren pitch, no hard knock on the door barges into our rooms, and on those nights you take your good fortune, store it like fat stores flavor, and you hold it because you know the next morning may ask you again what you've been breathing. The morning after the board had bent to Wolfe's will, I expected things to coast. That's usually how it goes. Wolfe pronounces. The guilty shuffle away nursing their bruises, and I'm left catching up with Kramer over a drink to trade barbs. But some cases don't quit after the curtain falls. This one had threads that didn't want to stay woven, and I should have known it when Wolfe took his breakfast with less relish than usual. He didn't comment on Fritz's sausages, which meant his mind was already chewing on something else. At 10 o'clock sharp, the bell rang, and I found Ruby Delgado on the stoop, pastry bag in hand, as if she'd come to pipe frosting on our walls. Her face was pale, her lipstick smudged, and her eyes too wide for a girl who usually kept to the corners. I let her in. She stood in the office like she was waiting for judgment, and then blurted it out before Wolfe could even adjust his bulk in the chair. "They're saying I told Nina what to do," she said, "that I gave her the resin." Wolfe didn't raise an eyebrow. He just rotated his hand, the one that always tells me to fetch facts before feelings. I guided her into the red leather chair, handed her water, and asked who they were. "Leo, mostly," she said, voice trembling. "He's furious. He thinks I betrayed Margaret, that I was jealous, that I wanted her ruined so I could rise. But it isn't true. I never spoke to Nina outside of tastings. Never." Wolfe studied her the way he studies a dish that's been set down at table but hasn't been tasted yet. "Why?" he asked at last. Would Mr. Mancini accuse you? Ruby twisted the pastry bag in her lap, squeezing it unconsciously so a little cream dotted the cloth. Because I turned him down, twice. He wanted more than partnership in the kitchen. When I said no, he grew cold. He knows if Margaret fell, he'd be the obvious choice to take over. But if he can blame me, he keeps his hands clean. I whistled low. So the chef's temper isn't just about garnish? No, Ruby said, and he's spreading it to staff, to clients. I heard from a friend. He's telling people Nina named me as her source. She swallowed. Is it true? Did she say that? I glanced at Wolfe, but his eyes were closed again. That means he's listening harder than if he stared you down. Miss Delgado, he said, Nina Corbett named herself with her hand and her bracelet, but she may now seek shelter, and shelters require scapegoats. If she speaks your name, it is not for truth, but for cover. Ruby leaned forward, relief warring with fear. Then you'll stop it. That, Wolfe said, depends. Have you ever handled resin of the type we discovered? She shook her head so quickly her bun came loose. Never. I don't even smoke meats. I bake. Sugar, butter, flour, clean flavors. I believed her, but belief isn't currency in Wolfe's house. Proof is. Wolfe drummed his fingers on the armrest once. Archie, you will visit Mr. Mancini. You will determine whether his accusations are spite, or if Miss Corbett has indeed begun to barter names. So I went. Leo's apartment smelled like garlic and ambition. He answered the door in a T-shirt with flour on it, arms crossed like he expected a fight. She came to you, didn't she? He said before I spoke. Delgado, crying she's innocent. She is, unless you've got better than gossip, I told him. His lip curled. Nina told me herself. Said Ruby slipped her the resin at the tasting last month. Said Ruby wanted to impress Pike, maybe get a job at Sable and Time if Margaret went under. I asked him if he believed that. He shrugged. Ruby's sweet, but sweet girls get tired of being ignored. She could have done it. He leaned closer. And don't think I didn't notice how quick Wolfe was to forgive Margaret. Maybe he's covering something. I left before my patience found its limit. Back at the brownstone, I reported. Wolfe sat like a stone idol, eyes hooded. Predictable, he said. Miss Corbett flails. Mr. Mancini indulges his vanity by repeating it. Proof, however, is absent. We must acquire it. He summoned Saul with a call. Saul came within the hour, and Wolfe tasked him with shadowing Nina, tracing her meetings, her calls, her visitors. If she was selling Ruby downriver, we'd catch her handing over the paddle. The day dragged, the orchids upstairs basking in smug light, Fritz fussing over veal stock, Wolfe motionless except for the slow turn of a page. I tried to read but kept thinking about Ruby's hands, white-knuckled on that pastry bag, and Leo's smirk when he smeared her name. It was dusk when Saul phoned. His voice, steady as a metronome, told me he'd watched Nina meet with Pike at a cafe on Madison. She handed him an envelope. Saul, being Saul, lifted it after they left. Inside, printouts of emails, all forged to suggest Ruby had been the one ordering resin from Resina Verde. Sloppy, but dangerous enough to stick if waved under the right noses. When I relayed this, Wolfe finally opened both eyes and sat a fraction straighter. That's as close as he gets to jumping up. Pike and Corbett persist, he said. They will not be satisfied with Miss Vance's humiliation alone. They must destroy loyalty within her kitchen to claim her clients. We will not permit it. He called Margaret, instructed her to bring Ruby and Leo to the office that evening. At 8, the trio arrived, Ruby still pale, Leo fuming, Margaret weary but resolute. Wolfe wasted no time. Miss Delgado, he said, is accused falsely. Mr. Mancini, you repeat these accusations without proof, driven by grievance. Miss Vance, your kitchen is the crucible of your livelihood. Discord there is fatal. Leo bristled. Nina showed me proof. Forgery, Wolfe said, and handed him the copies Saul had lifted, alongside the originals we had of Nina's true orders. Observe the typeface discrepancy. Observe the date mismatch. Observe the sloppy use of order instead of invoice. Amateur falsification intended to convince the credulous. You, sir, were credulous. Leo's face darkened. So she lied to me. She lied to ruin Ruby, Wolfe said, and to fracture your allegiance to Ms. Vance. You obliged her. Margaret looked between them, her voice sharp. Leo, you owe Ruby an apology. He muttered, but it came out. Ruby sat stiff, tears threatening but held back. Wolfe cut the moment with a single word. Enough. Ms. Vance, you will dismiss Nina's accusations publicly with the same force you once denied your culpability. You will affirm Miss Delgado's standing. That will extinguish the ember before it finds tinder. Margaret nodded. I'll call the staff meeting tomorrow. Ruby stays. Leo, keep your temper. We need unity, not war. Leo grumbled, but the fight in him sagged. Ruby exhaled, relief trembling through her shoulders. Wolfe closed his eyes again, signaling the session's end. After they left, I looked at him. You could have let it go. Margaret was cleared, the boards back on her side. Why wade into kitchen politics? Because, he said, sabotage is not only an act, but a contagion. Left unchecked, it spreads. If truth is to hold, it must hold everywhere it touches. He reached for his beer, sipped, and then added, Besides, if Mr. Mancini is permitted to rant unchecked, Fritz will hear of it, and Fritz will suffer indigestion. That I cannot allow. I grinned. So all this to protect Fritz's digestion? To protect mine, he corrected. The brownstone settled again, but I knew better than to assume the last ember was out. Nina and Pike weren't finished. They'd been cut off from the foundation, exposed to Kramer's scowl, but people who try to ruin reputations rarely accept exile quietly. They would try again, and when they did, Wolfe would be ready to receive them. Not with fire, not with fury, but with the same unshakable calm that had turned a roast's smoke into the rope that bound them. I sharpened my pencil, closed my notebook, and made a note to keep my shoes polished. Something told me I'd be walking more before this was over. The following morning promised calm, which is always a trick of the light in this business. Wolfe had returned to his orchids upstairs, leaving me to sift through clippings at my desk and pretend the world wasn't already twitching toward our door. At 11 o'clock, the bell rang with a kind of insistence that meant trouble. When I opened it, Kramer stood there chewing his cigar like it had personally insulted him. His coat was unbuttoned, his tie crooked, and his scowl told me he hadn't come for coffee. He barreled into the office without waiting for Wolfe to descend. I followed, resigned, and bellowed up the stairs. Wolfe made his entrance slower than a glacier, but no less inevitable. He sat, tugged his vest into place, and gave Kramer the kind of nod that could mean hello or what now. What now, Kramer said for both of them, is that Nina Corbett just walked into the precinct with a lawyer and tried to flip the story again. Claims Wolfe suppressed evidence, that Archie Goodwin forged transcripts to frame her, and that Pike's name was never involved. She wants the whole mess turned on you. I whistled low. Ambitious girl? Ambitious fool, Wolfe corrected, eyes narrowing. She believes that once cornered, the beast will retreat. Instead, it devours. Kramer grunted. Her lawyer waved around an affidavit from Pike. Says he never met her at that cafe, never saw resin pads, and that Wolfe cooked the whole tale to make a client happy. He tapped ash into our wastebasket. Now, I don't believe it, but you know how the commissioner feels when donors' names get dragged. If I can't smother this fast, someone higher up will try. Wolfe shut his eyes and pressed his fingers together. Archie, he said, we will extinguish the last ember before it spreads. Bring Saul. Saul arrived within the hour, silent as usual, carrying a folder thick enough to make Kramer lean forward. Inside were photographs. Nina and Pike together at the cafe, timed and dated. Another set showed them slipping into Pike's office after hours. A third, grainy but damning, caught Pike holding a small box with the same logo as the resin supplier. Saul laid them out like cards. Kramer's scowl softened, though it didn't vanish. Solid, but it won't stop her from talking. No, Wolfe said, but it will silence those who might listen. Tonight we gather again. Miss Corbett will be invited, with her counsel if she wishes. Mr. Pike as well, and Miss Vance, who deserves the satisfaction of seeing this farce ended. Inspector, you will attend, not as ally, but as witness. When she accuses, we will present. Kramer groaned. Another circus in your office. You think I enjoy playing audience? No, Wolfe said calmly. But you will. Because otherwise you will play defendant, accused of neglecting evidence you held in your hand. That settled it. Kramer swore under his breath but agreed. The rest of the day was spent preparing. Fritz polished glasses as though the fate of nations depended on clarity. I arranged chairs again, this time fewer, tighter, like a noose. Wolfe sat still, conserving himself until the knock came at 7. They filed in. Nina first, sleek in a dark dress, her serpent bracelet gleaming. Her lawyer, a lean man with sharp hair, followed, eyes scanning the room like he was pricing the furniture. Pike trailed after, nervous energy under his smug facade. Margaret entered with Kasia at her side, both rigid but steady, and Kramer planted himself in the corner, cigar unlit but chewing as if it kept him alive. Wolfe opened with no preamble. Miss Corbett, you accuse me of fabrication. You accuse Mr. Goodwin of forgery. You accuse my client of collusion. Speak. Nina's lawyer stood. My client maintains she never tampered with the roast. She was framed by rivals. Perhaps by Miss Delgado, perhaps by others. The so-called evidence against her is unreliable, gathered without warrant. Mr. Pike affirms she is innocent. Pike nodded too quickly. Yes, I never... Pfui, Wolfe said, so sharp it cracked the air. He gestured to Saul, who stepped forward with the photographs. Observe. You, Mr. Pike, with Miss Corbett at the cafe, the envelope changing hands. You again, outside your office, the resin supplier's box in your grasp. And you, Miss Corbett, wearing the serpent bracelet as you touch the cabinet vent, preserved forever in Mr. Cray's camera. The lawyer sputtered. This proves nothing. It proves everything, Wolfe said, voice still low but hard as stone. Your client lies. Mr. Pike lies. Their lies intersect and collapse. He leaned back. Inspector. Kramer stepped forward, took the photographs, the transcripts, and the resin pad jar I'd placed on the desk earlier. He studied them like a man already tasting his next cigar. Looks good enough to me. Perjury and obstruction for a start. Nina's lawyer paled. He leaned toward her, whispering. She kept her chin high, but her eyes flickered. Pike wilted outright, the salesman's smile long gone. Margaret finally spoke. You tried to destroy me, my name, my work, my staff. For what? A contract, a donor's favor. Her voice shook, but she didn't lower it. You won't succeed. Not now, not ever. Silence stretched. Wolfe closed his eyes, satisfied. Inspector, they are yours. Do not leave them here. Their presence is noisome. Kramer grunted, signaled to the 2 uniforms he'd stationed outside, and within minutes, Nina, her lawyer, and Pike were escorted out, their protests shrill but useless. The door closed, leaving the brownstone cleansed again. Margaret sat, hands trembling, then steadied them on her knees. It's over? Yes, Wolfe said simply. Because it must be. Malice thrives on ambiguity. We have stripped it bare. She breathed out, long and heavy, and rose. Then I'll go. I have a kitchen to protect. She glanced at me, and a debt I won't forget. When she left, Wolfe turned his head slightly toward me. Archie. Yeah? Do not expect me to tolerate another roast for at least a month. The very word offends. I grinned. Fair enough. We'll stick to lamb. He closed his eyes again, murmuring, Justice, like flavor, must be pure. When tainted, it poisons. Remember that. I sat back, letting the room breathe, and realized the case that had begun with a platter wrapped in foil had ended with reputations wrapped and sealed instead. The brownstone was still, restored to balance, but I knew the city outside was already grinding toward the next folly. And when it arrived, Wolfe would be waiting, immovable as ever, while I sharpened my pencil and kept my shoes polished for the chase. By morning, the city had done what it always does. Ground last night down to rumor and set up a fresh scaffold for today's outrage. I came down to the office to find the mail stacked like a leaning city block and Wolfe staring at it as if paper could be punished by disapproval. Fritz had set his breakfast with the fastidious tenderness of a man who believes eggs deserve a soft landing. Wolfe lifted his fork. The angle told me he'd eat because life requires feeding, not because he was in charity with the world. News moves faster than sauce thickens. Before the second cup of coffee, the Foundation had posted its statement. Ms. Vance exonerated, contract restored, apologies offered. It was short, which meant Miss Trent had found her spine and used only the parts of it that count. Kramer phoned, announced with a grunt that Nina was at central booking, Pike was out on a desk appearance ticket and a promise he'd regret, and LeMay had hired a barrister whose cufflinks had their own retainer. None of it ruffled Wolfe. He nodded once, a monarch acknowledging that the provinces were, for the moment, pacified. What did ruffle him, only a millimeter, but I've got a ruler for that, was the parcel. It arrived just after 10, hand-delivered, tied with a ribbon that had gone to finishing school. Fritz brought it in, set it on the corner of Wolfe's desk, and stepped back like a man who had nudged a snake with a spoon. I slit the ribbon. Inside sat a tasteful wooden box with a brass latch and the stamped crest of Resina Verde. Nestled in straw were tins with shy fonts: alpine resin, citrus ember, night pine. A card lay on top in handwriting that tried to look contrite and only managed expensive. For Mr. Wolfe, may these restore your faith in the art of aroma. VL. VL, I said. Victor LeMay sends a peace pipe. Wolfe didn't touch the box. Remove it, he said. To the kitchen? I asked, hopeful for Fritz's sake, if not mine. To the garbage, he said. Outside. I did as ordered. On my way back, I passed a delivery kid wheeling a dolly stacked with something that smelled like sincerity. Fresh flowers. Margaret. 2 tall vases appeared on the dining room sideboard. Late summer caught and stood at attention. A note for Wolfe said only, for the room that gave me back mine. For the record, it takes more nerve to send that to Wolfe than it does to put smoke in a roast. One insults the appetite, the other risks gratitude. Wolfe read it, set it down, and let his lips pare themselves into something that was not a smile and not a frown. A line that meant the world had, briefly, remembered itself. Saul dropped by at noon with his usual lack of ceremony. He put a folded slip on my blotter. Resin order log from Resina. Verde, handwritten in a clerk's careful script. Customer N. Corbett. Paid cash. Pickup by T. Pike. The clerk had signed and dated it, and Saul had, by whatever alchemy he uses, removed it from their files without removing their goodwill. I phoned Kramer. His grunt contained the rare mineral of contentment. That might have been the day's whole program if the city had cooperated. It did not. At 2 o'clock, my phone buzzed with Cassia's number. She does not call chat. Archie, she said, voice flat with anger the way ice is flat with cold. Someone left a small brass lid on our back step, like a cap to one of those show smokers. A note, try it, you'll like it. I will like putting it somewhere that makes a point. Gloves, I told her. Bag it. Don't touch the paper. Porter to stand watch. I'm on my way. Wolfe opened his eyes as I grabbed my hat. A last flicker, he said. Stamp it out. And take a breath before you enter that kitchen. You will be walking into a congregation of rage. He was right. Margaret's commissary had its knives sheathed, but its temper unsheathed. Porter stood by the back door like a wall with opinions. The brass lid and the note sat on a baking tray like school children in trouble. Kasia watched them as if they might confess. Ruby hovered behind, lips pressed tight, and even Leo's fury had focused into something more useful, a readiness to shut the door on whatever wind kept trying to blow them off their feet. I photographed the note, bagged the lid, checked the step for scuffs. No camera on the alley. Porter swore he'd heard a van engine idle and pull off, nothing more. I didn't need an orchestra to recognize the conductor. Pike had the ego for a parting shot. Whether he sent it or some underling did, the tune was the same. Malice has a poor sense of timing. It always arrives after the curtain, convinced it deserves an encore. Consider it a souvenir, I told them, of the last mistake your rivals get to make at your expense. Margaret's mouth made a line I'd seen men try to keep marching in the war newsreels. We're done being polite, she said. We'll be professional. There's a difference. Keep it, I said. Kramer will add it to his museum of poor decisions. Meanwhile, wash the step, throw the tray in the dish pit, and make something that smells like the opposite of resin. Ruby looked to Leo as if that instruction required translation. He grunted, then nodded. Lemon, he said. Butter. Herbs. Flour, Ruby added. Heat, Porter supplied. Discipline, Kasia finished. I left them with a kitchen's version of prayer and took the bagged lid to Kramer. He accepted it like a man receiving a final piece in a jig he'd already solved and wanted only for the pleasure of completion. Pike's phone pinged near the alley, he said. We're done. He meant it as a statement of fact and a favor. I could go tell Wolfe the world had decided to cooperate for once. Back at the brownstone, I delivered the swan song. Wolfe listened, nodded, and let silence reclaim the room. He sat without moving for so long the orchids could have photosynthesized a speech. At last, he said, Bring Miss Vance this evening. Bring Mr. Mancini and Miss Delgado. Not a crowd. 4 mouths as yesterday, but for a different lesson. I phoned. Margaret hesitated. She had a kitchen to run. But when Wolfe says evening, you consult your conscience and your calendar in that order. They came at 7, carrying the day's exhaustion like coats they couldn't check. Fritz had set the dining room with the lesser china, which would make a duchess sell pearls but is still nicer than anything most kings see. Wolfe did not perform. He never does. He permitted. Fritz brought a simple dish. Sole Veronique, grapes gleaming like a promise, sauce that dignified butter without bullying it. The room breathed. Knives clicked with quiet confidence. Margaret, who had not been still in days, was still. Wolfe lifted his glass 2 inches. You will eat, he said, and you will attend to your tongues. They have been insulted lately. They require re-education. No one laughed. We ate. If you think fish can teach ethics, you have not had Fritz's. After the plates had gone and the small cups arrived, coffee that could make a priest revise doctrine, Wolfe put his fingertips together and addressed the air between us. Sabotage, he said, is a declaration of impatience. It says, I will not suffer the slow victory of competence. I will seize its fruits by spoiling the orchard. You have had your orchard spoiled. You have replanted. Good. Now you will harvest differently. Miss Vance, you will keep your kitchen clothes to fashion. Mr. Mancini, you will curb your appetite for novelty until you can control it. Miss Delgado, you will resist the temptation to forgive too quickly. Trust requires proof, not yearning. And all of you will remember that fat is memory. Margaret blinked. Fat. Fat, Wolfe said. It keeps what touches it. It tells your mouth the truth long after the smoke has wandered off. Your work, your reputation, your dignity, they are fat. They will remember what you permit to touch them. If you allow vanity or fear to season them, you will taste it for years. If you insist on restraint and care, you will be nourished. He closed his eyes. There are men who bookend speeches with applause. Wolfe ends them with gravity. The room adjusted. After they left, the house loosened a notch. Fritz carried out a plate that had not been announced because Fritz believes in dessert the way mathematicians believe in proofs. Poached pears, syrup that refracted light, a restraint that tasted like confidence. Wolfe took one bite and set his spoon down with an acknowledgement that wasn't words. The phone rang once more, because a day like that does not go to bed without finishing its rounds. Mrs. Harrington, in person this time, her voice carrying the slight iron filings of a woman unaccustomed to needing anyone. She thanked Wolfe. Brief, clean. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, that the foundation would be funding a culinary scholarship in Ms. Vance's company name, for students with taste and spine. Wolfe made a sound that may have been approval, or indigestion at the word foundation. With him, the line is decorative. When I hung up, he said, "You will not tell Ms. Vance until the letter arrives. Spoken gratitude evaporates. Written gratitude persists." "Fat is memory," I said. He cracked an eyelid. "Don't be fatuous." "Wouldn't dream of it," I said, and made a note I would ignore if circumstances demanded. "I'm not a disciple. I'm a man with a typewriter and a conscience. If a woman who's had her livelihood dragged through resin needs a good thing early, I deliver it early." We lasted almost an hour without interruption. That's a record in this town, certified by the Institute of Wishful Thinking. Then the bell rang, and I found a hamper on the stoop with no card. Inside, a small table smoker, the kind Leo had cursed, and a stack of chips, Fruitwoods only. A ribbon, cheap this time, not LeMay's schoolboy satin. The note, if you could call it that, was a printed slip from a marketing department. "Elevate your events with a touch of smoke." I carried it into the office like a dead pigeon. Wolfe looked at it, then at me. "You wanted a sign that the world will continue as it was," he said mildly. "There it is." "Trash?" I asked. He considered, and, surprising both of us, said, "No. Give it to Mr. Mancini. He will disassemble it and demonstrate to his staff how to neutralize its effects if a donor insists on parading it. Then he will return it to the trash. Knowledge preceded by contempt is defense." I phoned Margaret. Her laugh was short and fierce. "We'll use it for one purpose," she said, "to show the difference between theater and flavor. Then it dies." "Funerals are not usually my beat," I told her. "But for that one, send flowers." After I set the smoker aside for delivery, the night settled in as if it had made a reservation. Wolfe read. I wrote up the day in notes I wouldn't need because I'd remember it anyway. The orchids held their phony jungle in the corner of my mind. From the kitchen wafted the last of the pears, warmth cooling into the kind of sweetness that says enough without saying the word. Before lights, Wolfe spoke into the room, not to me exactly, but I caught it because I catch what he throws whether or not he aims. "Men corrupt food to flatter themselves," he said. "They corrupt each other for smaller reasons. It is our work to refuse both. There is nothing moral in a roast, but there is morality in not lying about it. And in not letting others lie about it for you," I added. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The brownstone had resumed its hum, the city muttered beyond the curtains, and somewhere downtown a bracelet sat in an evidence locker, a snake biting its tail in a loop that, for once, had closed. Tomorrow would bring something else that smelled off. We would be here. He would sit, I would walk. And between the chair and the shoes, somebody's appetite for vanity would go hungry. The next day behaved itself until noon, which is later than most days manage. I shuffled bills and reproaches on my desk while Wolfe devoted himself to orchids and the illusion that New York could be held at bay by a closed door. Fritz's lunch was a bowl of consommé you could see your future in, and a salad that made virtue feel plausible. If that sounds like peace, don't be fooled. Peace in the brownstone is what you get right before somebody rings the bell with bad timing. It rang at 12:40. I opened to find Victor LeMay on the stoop with his scarf knotted like a truce flag. He was alone. No cane, no entourage. He looked smaller, which is a trick money can't pull but a sleepless night can. He asked for Wolfe in a voice that had been filed down. I weighed my options, shut the door, accept the apology at retail and pass it upstairs at wholesale, or bring him in and risk Wolfe's digestion. Curiosity won. I took him to the office, parked him facing the empty chair, and went to ring Wolfe on the house phone. He came down slower than Mercy, sat, and did not look at LeMay until the silence had learned the lesson. "I owe you a correction," LeMay said finally. "To you and to Miss Vance. My flourish opened a door. Others walked through. I mistook my taste for taste itself." He exhaled, a leak in a handsome balloon. "I have tendered an apology to the Foundation. I would like to make one here." Wolfe had two settings for contrition, impatience and tolerance. He chose the latter, which is rarer and therefore a better show. "Speak," he said. LeMay folded his hands, a trick he'd learned somewhere between prep school and shame. I was bored. I dressed it as enthusiasm. I thought I could improve what didn't want improving. It is an old story about men of means and other people's work. He looked at me, perhaps hoping a more human face would intercede. I kept my face in the neutral drawer. "And," Wolfe said, "I've arranged a culinary grant in Miss Vance's company name," LeMay said. "Discreetly, no ribbon cuttings. I'm not here for absolution. I know the bill will come due elsewhere, but if she takes the check, perhaps my vanity can be taxed." Wolfe regarded him as if he were a mushroom of uncertain provenance. "Philanthropy is not repentance," he said. "It is a hobby. If you must have one, cultivate restraint. Leave men and women to their competence. If you cannot, confine your experiments to your own plate." He tilted his head the smallest degree. "You attempted to return me a box yesterday. I declined. You will not send me aroma or apology again. Send Miss Vance a letter, and your silence." LeMay took the blow without flinching. His eyes were tired, and for once the cologne didn't arrive early. "Understood," he said. He stood, then paused. "Mr. Wolfe, when you said fat remembers, I thought it an epigram. It's an indictment. It turns out I can smell myself on last week." "Then wash," Wolfe said, and closed his eyes, which is how he dismisses you when he isn't inclined to stand. LeMay went, lighter by a box and heavier by a sentence. The phone trilled before the door had a chance to take a breath. Kramer, with the voice of a man who has wrestled a problem into a corner and is annoyed it didn't put up a better fight. "Pike folded," he said. "Sang about Nina to keep his own chorus light. The bracelet's in my locker and the resin orders in my file. Arraignments tomorrow." He paused. "Tell your giant he can stop teaching table manners to the rich. I'm not built for it twice." "You and me both," I said, and we hung up without ceremony. I conveyed the gist to Wolfe. He nodded in a way that meant the world had aligned itself with his expectation, and not a millimeter more. I had just returned to the soothing discipline of a sharpened pencil when Fritz stepped in, not with his usual serenity, but with an expression as close to alarm as his face allows. "In the kitchen," he said to Wolfe. "Someone moved the salt. It was on the right of the stove this morning. It is now on the left. I do not accuse, I report. You learn something about men by what disturbs them. For Fritz, it's salt's migration. For Wolfe, it's the implication behind a grain. He didn't rise, he doesn't, but he opened his eyes fully. Who touched it? He asked. No one whose hand I saw, Fritz said. But I turned to blanch the beans, and when I turned back, it was left. I looked at him. How long were you turned? 8 seconds, he said. If you think that's absurdly precise, you haven't met Fritz's blanching. No one else was in the kitchen? Gremlins, I suggested. The city issues them in spring. Wolfe lifted a finger, not for humor. It is of no practical import, he told Fritz, but the brownstone is not a democracy. Return it to the right and add a note on today's chart. Archie. Yes. Check the locks. All. We walked the ground like a patrol. Front, back, kitchen, pantry, basement, no tampering, no pry marks, nothing but the daily wear of a house that holds men who dislike being moved, which left either human error, Fritz's hand making treason against his habits, or the possibility that the brownstone wanted to remind Wolfe that control is a story we tell ourselves between interruptions. If the house wanted a joke, it picked a safe one. Back upstairs, the orchids observed us with their hothouse contempt for human concerns. Wolfe accepted Fritz's confirmation that the salt had been repatriated and dismissed the matter with a grunt, but the line between his brows told me it wasn't entirely dismissed. The case had begun with a subtle trespass. The house, jealous, had claimed its own. We had one more appointment left courtesy of my big mouth. When I'd phoned Margaret to arrange the smoker's brief educational life, I'd promised to swing by with a few lines she could use at the staff meeting, 5 simple sentences to cauterize rumor. She arrived at 3 to pick them up herself. She sat for once without the platter that had launched our week and read what I'd typed. We were targeted. We held. We will hold again. We do not cook for theater. We cook for mouths. She smiled. I'll borrow this voice, she said, and give it back when I've done. Wolfe watched her with his lids at half-mast. You will keep your staff, he said, or you will replace the ones who prefer drama to dinner. I recommend the former if they are worth saving. The discipline of a kitchen resembles the discipline of a mind. It cannot be imposed from without, only trained within. I'll train, she said. And if Leo tries to smoke a garnish for protest, I'll send him to peel grapes. He would improve them, Wolfe said. Send him to count them. That will tame him faster. She laughed, stood, and left with more shoulders than she'd arrived with. When the door closed, the room took a breath, and I started to think in terms of supper. It should have ended there, with the case folded and the brownstone restored. But this city likes an encore, even when the cast has gone home. At 5, a courier dropped an envelope through our slot, addressed in block letters to me. No return. Inside, a single glossy page, a mock-up press release from Sable and Time dated next week, crowing about a reimagined partnership with the Harrington Foundation. It was false to fact and tone, too brassy, too soon. If it was bait, it was cheap. If it was bravado, it was suicidal. I took it to Wolfe. He glanced and set it aside, the way a man sets aside a fly that has expired of its own boredom. Respond? I asked. No, he said. It is a draft of a fantasy. Reality has already issued its correction. The impulse to preen will hang them without our help. Dinner was duck with lentils and a sauce so honest it could have stood for office. Wolfe ate with more appetite than morning had promised. After coffee, he closed his eyes for a long minute that might have been prayer if he believed in anything but accuracy. When he opened them, he said, "Call Ms. Vance. Tell her that tomorrow at 2 she will permit Mr. Mancini to hold a demonstration for her staff with the smoker. He will instruct them in dismantling and in neutralizing residue. Then he will discard it." "Already done," I said. "She's planning to end with lemon tart to reset tongues." Satisfaction is not a word I use often about Wolfe, but for once it fit. He leaned back, which in him is a confession. "Good," he said. "A lemon tart is civilization." The phone stayed mercifully mute after that. At 10, I stepped out for air. The city was doing its lights trick, pretending to be domesticated. When I came back, the office smelled faintly of pears and paper and something else I've come to recognize as closure. I took the salt tin from Fritz's chart. He had added a neat notation. Moved, returned, and put it on Wolfe's desk with a pencil balanced across the lid. He looked at it and then at me. "You propose a memento." "A memento of the house reminding us that even in a fortress, someone moves the salt," I said. "Sometimes it's malice. Sometimes it's a man turning to blanch beans. The job is to know which and act accordingly." He would have groaned if he'd been a lesser man. He settled for a thin snort. "Do not aspire to aphorism, Archie." "It is a vulgar ambition, but yes." He tapped the pencil, aligning it by some inner plumb. "We restore, we instruct, we dismiss. We do not preen, and we eat." He reached for his beer. I flipped the last lamp off and let the dark arrange itself. Upstairs, the orchids kept their tropical conspiracy. Down here, the brownstone remembered and forgave in the same breath, which, for a house, is charity enough. I put my notebook away with the relief of a man shelving a file he won't need to open again. In the hall, the air was ordinary, and that is a luxury. When I shut the door behind me for the night, the latch clicked with the neat finality of a case that knows it's finished. The following afternoon unrolled in that rarest rhythm. Quiet. No courier, no board members, no donors in scarves trying to perfume their shame with apologies. Fritz occupied himself in the kitchen with preparations for squab. The orchids exhaled their smug perfume upstairs, and Wolfe stayed put in his chair, book balanced like an extension of his hand. I had just begun to think the case had finally exhausted its echoes when the phone rang with Margaret's voice, steady now in a way it hadn't been all week. "It's done," she said. "Leo showed the smoker to the team, broke it down, explained how it can be tampered with. Cassia drilled them on chain of custody for food. Ruby made lemon tarts and reminded everyone why they're there. It feels like a kitchen again." She paused. "I thought you'd want to know." "I'll pass it on," I said, though I knew Wolfe was listening already. When I hung up, Wolfe shifted his bulk a fraction. "Good," he said simply, which from him was a standing ovation. "A kitchen is an orchestra. It must tune itself or it collapses. Miss Vance has tuned hers." I asked if that meant we could close the book entirely. "It is closed," he said. "The malice identified, the reputations restored, the discipline reaffirmed. Inspector Kramer will gnash and grumble, but the courts will chasten Miss Corbett and Mr. Pike. Mr. LeMay will polish his silence, and Miss Vance will cook." That was Wolfe's style of ending, not with a flourish, but with order restored. He reached for his beer and sipped, then added in a tone low enough to belong to the room more than to me. "It is not murder that corrupts most often. It is vanity. Vanity is subtler, more invasive. It spoils reputations, meals, houses. We resist it with precision, with appetite disciplined, not indulged. That is justice." I wrote that line in my notebook because Wolfe never would, and because some truths deserve ink. The brownstone returned to its quiet pulse, a fortress once more, and if New York outside was already grinding toward the next folly, we would meet it when it came. He would sit immovable and relentless. I would walk, restless and observant, and between us the city would learn again that smoke, however thick, cannot hide the taste of truth, 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 the taste of truth,